Good afternoon in Budapest and good morning in New York City at the upcoming event of the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Hungary. At this special occasion, we are very happy to welcome Mr. Alexander Cooley, who is Clerto Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Director of Columbia University's Harriman Institute, and one who has been dealing with the past and future of American hegemony. Thanks for accepting our invitation. And next to Mr. Cooley, we also have the director of our institute, Mr. Márton Ugrósdy, in the conversation about the American hegemony. I think this is a very timely topic for two reasons at least. One is that the new policies of the Biden administrations are now taking shape before our eyes, basically. And I think that it's very timely to talk about American hegemony in Eurasia or the whole world because the Biden administration has the evolved aim of restoring American leadership, but also has a tendency for retrenchment. And I think this is a very interesting dynamics. The other reason why is it very important to talk about issues relating to the United States is that in these months we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Hungary and the United States. So we are very happy to host events related to this country and our country. This is Tamás Baranyi, Deputy Head of the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm going to moderate this discussion. And let me have just a couple of words about the format before we set out. So we are trying to have a more informal discussion lasting roughly 70-80 minutes, during which we are also very happy to receive questions from the audience. The way to ask questions is to send them directly to me through the chat of the Zoom platform so that I could read them aloud. So this is the format of posing questions. I promise that those questions that are received will be asked. So much for the format, and I think without further ado, let's ignite this conversation. And yes, we try to keep it more informal. Okay, so American hegemony, Eurasia, that's a whole lot of topics, but we have to begin at some point. So my point of beginning would be this. How China and Russia challenges the US-inspired order. Is it, as narrative often claims, a concerted effort of authoritarian states to challenge democracies, or is it rather a normal, natural way nation states other than the United States think of international relations, international affairs? So to what extent is a normal challenge posed by nation states, and to what extent is an ideological debate? So this is my first question to ignite the discussion. And Mr. Cooley, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. So it's a real pleasure. It's a real honor to be here with you and be talking about these issues, especially on the cusp of such illustrious anniversaries. I mean, this question is right at the heart, I think, of real changes that are occurring in global and world politics at the moment. It's, I think, very easy to focus on the ideological component here, that somehow this is a grand struggle between liberal democracy and authoritarianism. There are many who would like to frame the challenge in that way. There are rather elements of truth to that, right? And also it depends a little bit on the country and the episode involved. But very broadly, what we're seeing is a power transition, really. It's a power transition away from the 1990s. In the 1990s, we had the sudden collapse, not only of the Soviet Union, but of this alternative international order that the Soviet Union represented, right? Albeit in the economic sphere, the security sphere, in the ideological sphere. And all of a sudden, the US-led order was the only game in town. And joining it became a priority. And if you weren't part of it, even if you didn't believe in it, you found yourself ostracized or even declared rogue, right? We can date the peak of US hegemony in different ways. I choose to do it in 2004, right? With the completion of NATO expansion as well as the EU enlargement. Also, this was a time in which the US was focused in Afghanistan, had military presence overseas and so forth. So in terms of kind of a peak Eurasia moment, to me, it's around there. But what has happened? Certainly, there is an ideological challenge to liberal democracy. So let's talk about that first very quickly. I think the challenge isn't one of necessarily authoritarianism. It's trying to undercut the universality of political liberalism and also to challenge Western hypocrisy on it. And so I think of the challenge in terms of various counter norms, not just one. None of these is universal, say the way sort of communist ideology was universal, right? But I think in terms of the norm of security and sovereignty, right? And particularly designating groups that pose real and imagined challenges as either terrorists or sort of security risks. I think of the traditional values challenge, right? This is the one most associated with Russia, the idea of focusing on the family, re-emphasizing morality, rediscovering a role for religion, this kind of stuff. And then the Chinese-led norm of civilizational diversity, right? All civilizations are great. You have a great civilization, we have a great civilization. We're not going to judge each other and we're not going to impose conditions, right? That's been quite powerful in Eurasia, right? As these sorts of counter norms have taken hold and they've offered alternatives to what was being spread before. The second thing that's happened on the normative sense, democracy and its promotion has gone from being perceived as a political nuance with the colored revolutions, and of course the war in Iraq, to being perceived as a security threat by regimes. That's a big switch. Because the minute you perceive something to be a regime threat, you view it in a security type lens and framework, and you take steps appropriately to deal with it, right? This happened in the mid-2000s, and it's still in the process. So I think those are major developments. The other things that are happening in Eurasia is that Russia has adopted a kind of mimetic set of institutions through which it wants to assert its own influence in Eurasia, whether it's its own economic architecture, the Eurasian Economic Union, its own security architecture, the CSTO, and develop these in a way that it regards as a sort of a twinning to what the West was doing. And of course, China later to the game, but also trying to add layers onto this architecture, whether it's the 17+1 mechanism, whether it's bilateral Belt and Road initiatives and dealings, or whether it's pressures over the adoption of 5G technology and Huawei. All this to say is that international ordering now in Eurasia is much less clear than it was before. There are more layers, there are more institutions, there's more fabric. If you want to think of it in an ecological metaphor, it's not just the Western ecosystem anymore. It's the Russian ecosystem. It's the Chinese ecosystem too. And my very final comment is that there is also a significant international ordering aspect to this. In the States, we've tended to dismiss this, right? And we've sort of said, well, international order is nothing but a function of what the strong make it. And we can't understand the Russian-Chinese relationship in Eurasia unless we understand and take international order seriously. Because a lot of US commentators look at this relationship and they say, well, you know, Russia just accedes to every wish that Beijing has in the region. When is it going to wake up and realize that its interests in places like Central Asia are being undercut by China? And my response is the Russians are willing to sacrifice their immediate interest in the region exactly because they feel a joint Russian-Chinese front against US-led international order is worth that. And in some ways, they're too locked in to go backwards now. So concepts like greater Eurasia now, right, which are meant to, I think, paper over the tensions that you have between Russia and China, are a function of this idea of emphasizing the struggle against US order. So it's far too long of an answer for you, but I think the nutshell is the world is much more dense, much more complicated, much more contested now than it was 30 years ago.
Thank you very much. It was indeed in itself a dense answer. Márton, please, how would you complete this answer?
Well, I would like to pick up on 2 points. First is a normative challenge. I very much like the idea, although I think the major difference between what we have right now and what we had in the Cold War is significantly different, because the ideological component in my reading is missing. So if you look at the Soviet Union, it wanted to aggressively export its own way of life, its own economic system, its own societal system to a large extent, and you were either with them or against them. And because Hungary was part of that world, of course, we never want to go back, because we didn't really like it. We staged a revolution against the Soviets in 1956, but still, that kind of equal normative challenge that the Soviet Union has meant to the Western world, if I can put it that way, which was obviously US-dominated world even back then, is not necessarily there at the moment. Alex was right in saying that China has a different approach, that you have great civilizations all over and you have to respect the other one. I do not really see this normative challenge on the Russian side, to be very honest. So they say that Russia is more of a spoiler than an actor which is actively shaping the system. And I think what we see as Russian foreign policy when it comes to exerting their influence in Western democracies is more about our own shortcomings than the Russian creation of these problems. And we often miss that point because it's easier to blame the Russians. I mean, if I look at the last 2 US presidential elections, I see that it was easier to blame the Russians than to face our own difficulties. 1 second. Mimetic structures, I would agree to some extent, even though if I look at the Eurasian Economic Union, if I look at CSTO, I often miss the substance of that, in a sense that yes, they are like these Western integration institutions, but substantially, you know, even the Eurasian Economic Union is if you compare the economic power of that to even the European Union or China itself, it's tiny and I dare to say insignificant. And yes, you have some kind of liberalized trade between these countries, but it's dominated by Russia. So you do not really see that kind of somewhat equal partnership, if you wish, that you see in other structures like in NATO and in the European Union. Footnote, of course, relations are not equal even within these organizations, but we at least pretend that they are equal.
Okay, so I grasp that none of you really prioritize ideological struggle as a very important element of this competition, this diffusion of power or power transition, as Alex you put it. So then the ideological element of this power rivalry is more like an operationalization on the side of the United States. So it's easy to put it in a way that it's authoritarianism versus democracies for the sake of power struggle.
Well, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's a simpler framing, right? That helps to also create good guys and bad guys, sort of instantly, designate sides that we need to take. And I agree with the general proposition that, you know, Russia is not pushing any, you know, one particular ideological alternative. I think they're actually being quite opportunistic. And this focus on poking holes, right, in the inconsistencies of the West is the strategy. That is the strategy, right? Whether it's, you know, Lavrov or RT or, and what makes that possible? What makes that possible is that when you are a hegemon, right, or a global power, there is always a gap between the principles that you espouse and your actual actions. And what's happened now is that you can we term this sometimes in academia as hypocrisy costs, right? That difference. How hypocritical are you being in any particular issue? So the problem with hypocrisy costs is that in a world of global media, social media, they're always magnified more. Is the US any more hypocritical now than it has been in the past? No. But one of the things you could do in the past is you could take this relationship with Saudi Arabia, you could not talk about it, you could bury it, you could not focus on it, you could say that this is just something for the expert realm or just energy people are gonna deal with it. Now, in the era of global media, where we have high profile image making, where we have episodes like Khashoggi, where we have the war in Yemen covered by also non-Western media outlets. The question of what are the costs of our relationship with Saudi Arabia are magnified 100-fold. They're there on full display for full criticism. So the US has always had this mix of pragmatism and idealism. It's just that that gap now is really quite obvious and glaringly obvious. The second dimension of this is that the basket of so-called values issues in kind of liberal democracy has also expanded. It's not just political rights now, it's not just democracy, it's LGBTQ, it is also anti-corruption that the Biden administration is pushing. And so how do you manage this heterogeneity of values? Again, if you're on the other side, the tactic is to pick any one of these and say, you're being completely inconsistent here, you so-called values promoters. And I'll give you an example. This is exactly what happened with the campaign against Alex Navalny. So Amnesty International, UK, originally had him designated as a prisoner of conscience, right? Then they revoked that status, and they revoked that status in response to an information, I would say, misinformation campaign that the Kremlin was involved in, that sought to magnify his statements made against migrants over 10 years ago. He had some unkind things to say about Central Asian migration in quite a nationalistic kind of way. And then Amnesty saw that and say, well, he cannot be a prisoner of conscience and hold those views about migration. If you're going to do that, no one is going to, right, fit all of these normative boxes. But that has become a tactic now, right? And that is something in which the whole kind of normative fabric of the Western order, I think, is quite vulnerable to. Now, the end of the story is that Amnesty received pressure from outside. They realized what they had done was making them, quite embarrassed and look foolish, and they reinstated the designation. But I think the kind of anecdote illustrates that in this day and age, any kind of inconsistency from kind of liberal purity can be seized upon in these sorts of ways. So yeah, I'm not sure the behavior is that much different than in the past, but its exposure is certainly a lot more glaring than it was before.
Marty, anything to add?
In your previous intervention, Alex, you said that the challengers are also challenging Western hypocrisy on liberal democracy. And I think one of the reasons it's so easy to do nowadays is the proliferation of the rights issues. So, for a long time, when the US was preaching about the spread of democracy, it was elections, freedom of speech, very basic things on which there was a consensus in Western society that these are our liberal values, which come from the French Enlightenment and the Judeo-Christian heritage and so on and so forth. And right now, you have all these sexual minorities, minorities of conscience, and the problem with that is that you do not have any kind of definition of this even back in the United States because they're politically contested. And since you do not have these, you do not have the consensus on what should be exported, obviously it's really hard to have the common say on that, because if you start to do that, and the Biden administration is just trying this, you would say, okay, but what about this? What about North Carolina? What about Idaho and all the states which are not legalizing weed, for example? So you can always find a counterexample in the United States for something that the US federal government wants to push in its foreign policy. And it's a very high-flying ball that the opponents will always smack. And because of that, I think it's really easy to challenge this kind of US preaching of values at the moment. And the other thing which caught my attention was that you said that we still tend to think in boxes. And Navalny, I think, is a perfect example, but Protasevich, the Belarusian guy who was put into prison and released since then, is another example that, yes, I mean, they're doing things that you might like as someone who's living in a Western democracy, but there are at least 2 or 3 sides of that coin. And they might be proud patriots, meaning that they're evil nationalists in some liberal newspapers in the West. So the picture is often more complex. And because of that, the small details and the tailor-made approach in this kind of activist US diplomacy is often missing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, your point about the internal conflicts and struggles in the US is a very good one. And I think it is increasingly difficult to export something that is contested domestically. Not only that, I think you still see, and you saw this in the Trump administration, a much more aggressive export of counter norms in the Trump administration than you did before in other Republican administrations. Yes, there was always this kind of question about banning federal support in US development overseas for abortion, right? That's been consistent since sort of Reagan, but it extended much further. It extended to some of the programs the Justice Department was running, especially places like Central America, sort of focus on faith, questions of sort of, religious freedom. There was a sense in redefining the rights agenda too, right? In a much kind of a narrow way. There was a sense in which this kind of values component was far more aggressive before from the kind of, illiberal side than it had been before. And you saw that also with US ambassadorial appointments, throughout Europe, appointing ambassadors, for instance, who didn't support the EU in EU countries, right? This was a change from the past too. So all this to say is that what I see now, just in picking up on your point, is contestation all the way through, right? Domestically, regionally, globally, and sort of this neat separation between sort of domestic and foreign policy, it just doesn't work in the same way, or it carries the dangers that you talked about. And I think this phrase that we use in the foreign policy administration, first we have to get our own house in order, and then we'll be back. This is part of the same challenge, right? When you think about the forces, economic and normative, structural, that are facing our world, they're the same forces that are exerting pressures domestically as they are regionally and globally.
I think what is interesting that you see that kind of globalization of this domestic US challenge as well. So I don't think that you would have ever imagined that Prime Minister of a small Central and Eastern European country will be a player in the US presidential election, for example, that can become a topic. Like President Obama used our example in one of his campaign speeches last year, or that there could be such kind of cooperation between the thinkers on both political sides from Europe and beyond with their US counterparts. So ideology, ironically, became very globalized. And I think that kind of separation, hard separation between domestic and foreign policy is impossible anymore. Because since all of the foreign ministers are on Facebook and they are mostly running for re-election, you will see that anything they do, all the meetings they have are about polishing their own personal profile, picking fights that they shouldn't pick, but fights which make sense from the domestic point of view. And of course, we usually tend to conclude in these cases that, yeah, it's so evil that domestic policy is interfering with the long-term interests of countries, but that was never like that. We pretended that it was not like that, but I think right now it's laid out barely on the internet and on the social media sites. And we have to come to a moment of reckoning, if you wish, that this is how politics and foreign policy works.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also a sense of what's your benchmark here. I think for the US foreign policy establishment, and frankly, for a lot of US international relations theory, the benchmark is the 1990s. That's a problematic benchmark, right? Because when you use that as your benchmark, then everything seems as slippage, everything seems as, you're not in as much control, you're not as respected anymore, you're not sort of hegemonic. But if your benchmark is the early part of the 20th century, then things now appear a lot more reverting to the mean. And the mean is contestation. Contestation of ideas, contestation of nations, transnational networks that contest with each other, right? It was just that in the 1990s, we talked about kind of transnational influence and regional influence in terms of sort of one set of norms and procedures, right? Kind of transatlantic and liberal democratic ones sort of expanding. And we didn't take the other side sort of seriously. And I think, to me, that's the sort of standard to judge these on, is, are they offering an avenue for contestation? And of course, they're not necessarily going to be successful or effective, right? Witness Lithuania say, I'm out of the 17+1, right? We're not going to do this. Or the Kazakhs rebuffing the Russians in the Eurasian Economic Union saying, no, we're not going to use the Eurasian Economic Union to counter Western sanctions. So it's not like these are sort of complete victories for the challengers. It's just, there are more political arenas now, right? There are more venues. There's just a much more densely contested kind of agenda and ecosystem. And for me, the one kind of public attitude that underscores what's happened domestically in the US is the following. Chicago and Council on Global Affairs released a survey, I believe it's in February this year, asking Democrats, Republicans, Independents by political affiliation to identify the greatest threat. Not attitudes towards multilateralism, those are predictable splits, or the UN or foreign aid. What is the greatest national security threat to the United States? And what really struck me, high plurality of Republicans answered China, right? Simple, straightforward answer. I think it was about 45%, 46%. For Democrats, the same plurality answered extremist right-wing movements within the US, right? And militia movements within the US. And so, in other words, they saw threats as internal, right, as opposed to external. And so we do not have ideological consensus on what constitutes even a national security threat. We are in a very different place than we have been for some time. Even 10 years ago, when Islamic terrorism, right, was still viewed by both sides as the overwhelming sort of threat to American security. In the same survey, only 10% of Democrats, 15% of Republicans thought that ISIS or Islamic extremism constituted the main threat. So we're really in uncharted territories for the post-Cold War era. That's not necessarily true if we take a broader historical perspective.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I initiate a little different topic. No, it's pretty much the same actually. So the Biden administration came to power, with the atmosphere that there's a new sheriff in town, and a new progressive sheriff in town, promising to restore American leadership, promising to restore alliance unity on the one hand, and also to be more demanding on the values side. So at first, demanding allies to respect the norms and values they propose in a more complete way, but also to forge unity among the allies. And I always consider this sort of a contradiction in itself. So how do you get your allies act together with more and more strict, norms that they should follow? I think that's sort of a controversy. And also there is this American aim to restore American leadership at one hand, and on the other hand, there's a clear tendency for retrenchment. So they are getting out of Afghanistan, for instance. They're pledging not to interfere in this or that particular topic in far sides of the world. So how do you see what is the aim of the Biden administration out of those, out of this basket? So do they want to restore hegemony, or they want to reach a balance that is more sustainable? And by doing so, what is this balance between values and alliance unity? So maybe it's a little too complicated question. It's more like a topic to consider. So where will you pick up the thread, Mr. Cooley?
Well, it's a complicated question because it's a complicated situation. And I think the truth is there's a variety of different points of view within the Biden administration. Let's start from this premise, though. I think this is very important. Joe Biden would not be president, I'm going to say this confidently, would not be president today if it weren't for the Russia-Georgia war. Just very starkly, right? This was 2008. It was in the process of selecting a vice president under the Obama administration. War in Georgia breaks out. And remember, John McCain considers themselves good friends with Georgian President Misha Saakashvili, right? And he's pounding this issue, and he's getting headway in the polls. So Biden is on that presidential shortlist. He is selected because there's a perception he can bring gravitas, right? And foreign policy and security experience. He knows how to confront Russia, be seen as tough in Russia, and is viewed as a friend of Georgia at the time. So here we are. So Biden is shaped not only by an experience like this, but in his time in the Senate on various committees. He is very much about alliances, keeping commitments to your partners, and he views European security in core ways. So I think, having said that, as his identity, I think there have been two lessons learned, one from the Trump administration and one from the Obama administration. The lesson from the Trump administration has been this idea of getting back to a more kind of community-based approach as opposed to this hardcore transactional bilateral approach, right? Of course, Trump was willing to augment troop levels in Poland. He had the kind of the troops on the ground part of the deterrence. It's just there weren't a lot of warm and fuzzy feelers that were going on about the value of the alliance, common values, democracy, of course, and so forth. And so I think this idea of, making US hegemony more palatable by emphasizing, right, the sort of community partnership aspect of it. The fact NATO's not just an alliance of countries that don't pay up, right? It's a community, it's a security community, right? This rhetoric has changed. So I think that's one. But you know what? Equally important is, I think, Biden's lesson from the Obama administration, and especially the kind of disastrous pivot to Asia. Why was this disastrous? Because when you're a hegemon and you say, we are now going to emphasize this theater, right? Asia. And again, for your viewers and listeners, this was the attempt by Obama to focus attention and resources into Pacific diplomacy, both the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but also escalating a troop presence in places like the Philippines, Australia, in a rotational fashion and so forth. And so you heard instantly these calls that, places like the Baltic states, for instance, oh my God, the Obama administration is abandoning us. Why? They didn't intend it. But anytime you say our priority is there, sides are going to say, well, if it's there, it means it's not with us, right? And so you cannot but generate fears of abandonment when you're a global hegemon and you say that you're moving into a different space. So I think Biden, I don't know how on board he was with the pivot to Asia, but certainly he did not like the unintended consequences of it. So I think for him, strengthening in a very public, demonstrative, I would even say kind of theatrical way, this idea of, our common partners, our common values is extremely important to him, because for him, this is the core nucleus of American power and the American security system. Now, and I'm very curious to hear, you know, the interpretations how this looks like from, you know, from the ground level in Central Europe. Can this be done at the same time in which the world is changing? And is there a risk here that you almost become a little bit of a kind of a reverse Warsaw Pact situation? I know it's a strained analogy, where you demand total fealty and loyalty on the dogma, right? But you don't allow an evolution to take place, which it has to take place, whether it's questions like China or other technological standards or sort of investments. There has to be some room for partnership and dissent and growth. Otherwise, we're in a world where we're just performing alliance management, and we're not actually engaging in some of the more difficult sort of substantive, you know, talks about, you know, European defense, autonomy, and, you know, the parameters of alliance management.
Márton, could you provide us with a Central European Hungarian perspective on this issue?
When I think President Biden came to Europe last week, if I'm correct, one of the messages was that America is back. Now, the problem is that Europe has moved in the meantime. So, you know, we're not in 2016 anymore. We're not in 2008 anymore. And I think the Trump presidency was very, ironically, very useful and good for Europe in a sense that all these movements and questions about how closely we are allied, are we economic rivals with the United States? What is the role Europe should play in the world and how we should organize ourselves? These questions could be asked legitimately because that was the way how you challenge President Trump from the outside. And this is a can of worms. You cannot close it anymore. And I think when it came to the visits last week and the G7 and all the others, it was very visible on the European side that, yes, Joe, it's so great you're here. We're ready to work with you, but you know, we're doing a lot of business with China, so please don't break that because we need that money. We need China as a trading partner, and China is not a systemic rival for us. So please do not export your fears of how you're going to lose your hegemony over the world using European taxpayers' money, if I can put it that way. So I think there is a kind of misunderstanding / difference of interest when it comes to the reestablishment of alliance management, in a sense that Europe became a bit more self-conscious in the last 4 years. And because of the ideological divide within the US, you cannot really believe in these dogmas anymore because they're actively being challenged from the inside. And on the other hand, I think some countries, including the country I know best, might get a feeling that right now it costs more to be an ally of the United States than be an enemy of the United States. So that kind of alliance management, which was very dominant for a long time, that, you know, someone at the top says something and everybody's implementing it, is not sustainable anymore. And I think that also shows the limits of US influence in Central Europe to a large extent, because what we see is that in the case of countries which need the US as an insurance policy against the perceived Russian or whatever aggression, they're going to stand in line with these requirements no matter what, because they don't have any other choice if their feeling of existential threat is so imminent. But you see other countries which are not feeling threatened by the United States, but are benefiting from trade with China and trade with Iran and other countries. And right now, I'm not talking about Hungary, so just don't have any misunderstandings here. But we see some major EU member states doing business with Russia, doing business with China, without any ideological constraints. Yeah, they have those 5 minutes when they talk about human rights in Xinjiang and so on, and then they talk about billions and billions of dollars of deals they're going to do with these countries. And that kind of third way approach to the US position in the world, I think cannot be undone anymore. And as the relative power of the US is receding, especially when it comes to the economy, it will be really hard to sustain that kind of commanding presence that we have seen from the American side on 5G, on Chinese investment, and so on and so forth.
Okay, can I complete you in just a little bit, and I will step out of my strict position here as a moderator, because the Central European approach, I think, is particularly interesting in this topic. I think a couple of weeks ago at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade, we had an inside game, let's say, which we tried to, some of us ventured to make an American grand strategy. Now that the United States is also making sort of a grand strategy, we had this game to make it known. Some of our members joined, and this was a very thoughtful game with excellent results, I would say. And interestingly enough, most of them contained an element that in order that the United States could strengthen the alliance in Europe, they would need to be more inclusive, be more acceptive to differences within the alliance. And it was very surprising, because we tried to involve many different views from Central Europe, also from, let's say, Poland, Slovakia, and so forth. That this seemed sort of a common ground that with some less expectations, it could be done more. And all of those American grand strategies actually showed a huge degree of transatlanticism. So there is a large degree of transatlanticism in Central Europe, though, as Márton, you put it excellently, that America is back, but Europe has, gone a little further at this time. And this is something that I think the Central European academic community and think tank community has in common, that they really believe that the Americans should admit this as a fact. And interestingly enough, we saw that the Biden presidency is moving away to this direction, but maybe we are wrong. So this is how I would complete your thoughts, Márton. And I think I'm getting back to the moderator position right now. So I don't know, Alex, if you have an answer to this or comment.
No, I mean, I think it's, both Márton's and your riffs on that are very clear. And, all I would sort of underscore is just say, yeah, the US has a credibility problem now, right? Even if it had a unified values, how can the US credibly commit, right, that it's not just going to sort of swing back in a pendulum and, revert to sort of, the bad cop image of the previous administration, right? It can't. And that's something that no amount of policy, no kind of thinking, no brilliance in the National Security Council really can overcome. So, I think that the question is, how do we, how do we have a forward-looking agendas that thinks about those parameters of inclusion? And I think, in Márton's sort of calculus, changing the cost benefit structure for countries that are not sort of core on the liberal values, so that they still see more value of being in the architecture as opposed to opposing the architecture.
Okay. In the meantime, we've received questions from the audience. So from Joe Chutak, I would pose you two questions relating to China. So one is, do you see any major difference between Biden and Trump administration's China policy? And do you agree with some strategies who expect a real hot conflict between the US and China in the next 5 years? So China policy at large, is there any hardening or softening since the Trump years? And can it be a hot conflict in the coming years? So what is your take on this, Alex?
I mean, I certainly hope it's not going to be a hot conflict in the years, but we're trending towards more and more competitive relations. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think those who thought that Biden somehow would roll back a lot of the Trump kinds of policies and posturing were disappointed. I think there's a couple of areas in which there have been more kinds of symbolic concessions. So, questions of visas, Chinese students coming, right? This is an issue that's on our mind. Also, I think there is not this fervor for economic decoupling within the Biden administration as there were amongst some people in the Trump administration. I frankly see decoupling also as an impossibility, just given the trade volumes. So there's some changes in style, some limited issues, but the important issues, what do we regard Chinese investment? Do we regard this as good for the world or as competitive and undermining our interests? Well, I think it's competitive and undermining our interests. Look at the statement that Biden thrust onto the G7. How do we view Chinese efforts in third-party neighborhoods, whether it's Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and the Afghanistan sort of theater, sort of Africa? Do we view these relations as complementary or competitive? Competitive. How do we view 5G? Is this kind of a zero-sum security risk? Yes. So, issue after issue, you're seeing a kind of an acknowledgement that we're, in this world of strategic competition. The real test now is how far do you go, right? So let me give you an example. One of the things Biden administration did is through the Exim Bank agreed to pay back Ecuador's debt to China that it had amassed in the loans for shares deal for energy. And on condition that Ecuador drop its 5G partnerships. Okay. So is this going to be done with every country? Right? Does every country that has partnered with China or sort of feigned partnering with China, are they going to have a buyout? Are they going to get their own package? Right? Is Ecuador a national security priority for the United States? I think all of these are really difficult questions. The US just doesn't have the resources to be able to financially outbid China in every country of concern. So the great power competition framework doesn't actually do much work in terms of identifying what are the core areas of American responsibility or transatlantic responsibility, right? What are we willing to trade off to protect them? How far does the US global reach extend now? And in what issues? And until we start grappling with those issues, we don't have a defined national security strategy, and we're dealing in platitudes.
So if this economic rivalry has its limits, as you said, because you cannot repay every Ecuadorian debt for China, then the other thing would be military arms race, and we are all hoping that arms race and hot conflicts would be avoided in the Indo-Pacific region. So if not military and not economic, then how the United States can take up the glove vis-a-vis China? Is there a third way?
I mean, I think there's different issues that are going on that present sort of different types of challenges. So take pandemic politics. These issues can change very quickly. The beginning of the pandemic, it seemed as if US was dithering. We obviously had the real loss of life here. We had the perception of an incompetent response on the part of the US government. And we had China, who was sending medical equipment, advisors, and this kind of very high profile medical diplomacy, right? Overseas, places like Italy, Spain. Now, a year later, the optics of the pandemic and its geopolitical effects, I would argue, has changed, where the metric has shifted from loss of life, unfortunately, to vaccination rates, right? That sort of signals sort of competency. That I know Hungary is doing very well, but the US is doing very well too, especially vis-a-vis the BRIC countries. And I think the sort of opportunities that China saw in using the pandemic to emphasize its role as a global health goods provider, as a member of the WHO, as a vaccine developer and distributor, all of these have been undermined recently, right? Including the ineffectiveness, it seems like, in some areas of Chinese vaccines compared to the mRNA vaccines. So all this to say is that there is an element of unpredictability in global political life, right? That attempts to curry influence using one currency don't always work out the way that you thought. The overall trend is one towards contestation, but I would argue the Chinese haven't proven terribly skilled at handling what I think has been a good set of geopolitical cards dealt with them. In fact, they've been awful. You know, the wolf warrior diplomacy meme has been highly ineffective and has ostracized many countries. So, you know, I think that the takeaways I get from the Pew surveys is, you know, Trump and Trump's handling of the pandemic was deeply unpopular everywhere in the world, but she didn't come out looking all that much better. A little bit better, but not all that much better. And I think actually the gains that China could have made, you know, given the circumstances, have not been realized. So I think there is this element of unpredictability as sort of global challenges sort of pop up that nation states have to manage and has real consequences for their images.
No, that's pretty clear. Thank you. Last year, there was this American Russian summit at Geneva last week, and I think many people in Europe had the idea that the Americans might have in mind something that we might term as, you know, to Kissingerize China, to try to you know, facilitate a rapprochement with Russia, you know, very cautious, very mild, very soft rapprochement with China, in order to have more countries on board against China. They are very well aware of the manifold challenges and conflicts between these two gigantic nations. So this is one idea that many Europeans had in mind, I think, when they were watching the events last week. But also it is pretty clear that there is a limitation by domestic politics in the US, because Russia is still the primary target of many people in Congress and the media and the American public, who have been told for 4 years that that the greatest adversary is Russia, and Russia is trying to meddle in with US elections. So I think there is here a clear strategic aim. I don't know if the Americans' aim is this, but it seems sometimes, and also domestic limitations to it. So how do you see, is there an American idea to try to decouple at least Russia from China?
We'll be curious in Martin's view on this. I think it's tricky and nuanced. I think there are differences here between the Trump administration and Biden administration, and I'll explain them in this way. Trump himself, and we know this from his advisors now who have spoken up after the fact, and his close circle of White House advisors, believed in what you were talking about. They really did see an opportunity to try and enlist Russia as, if not a partner against China, try to pry Russia away from China in very kind of crude geopolitical terms. Trump really thought that way, and that's why he didn't like the sanctions either. With the Biden people, it's less that case. I don't think most of the Biden people are under any illusion that Russia can be peeled away from China. They're in too deep, they're too intertangled, and actually a lot of their interests sort of align and converge. But then why the summit? The summit was less a case of trying to pick Russia off, and more of a case of let's try and compartmentalize and manage the Russian relationship so it doesn't flare up unexpectedly and distract us from China. I think that's the purpose, right? That you want to make the Russian relationship as bad as it is. You want to give it a roadmap. You want to give it some stability and some predictability. You want to deal with some very core issues like strategic stability talks, like getting our ambassadors reinstated, setting up some sort of format for the working groups. But you want to do it early on so that you're not having to deal with, you know, Russia popping up at every moment in an unexpected way. And then that generates these domestic dynamics that you talked about. You're soft on Russia, you don't know how to deal with Putin. And that really diverts you from everything that you want to do at the global level and with China. So that's how I read the summit. So different reasons for engaging with Russia between Trump and Biden. But I do think we should take Biden at his word in the sense that we're not going to know whether the summit was successful or not until a few months from now, whether there's actual generation on it, or rather momentum on any of the agenda that was generated, or whether, you know, things are just at a standstill.
Marty, could you complete this with a Central European perspective? You know, Central Europe, that is a region which has a long historical experience of the Russia challenge, but not really the China challenge. So how do you see it from Central?
I think the summit was really interesting in a way that there was a warning shot before the leaders actually convened, and that was the announcement by the US government that they're not going to sanction the companies participating in Nord Stream 2. That was a long-standing issue, especially with the two major European allies, Germany the most importantly, but we also see some French and Dutch companies involved. So I think there's a feeling / reading in Europe at the moment that the US let Russia off the hook in exchange for Europe being more tougher on China. And if you look at the overtures of Macron and Merkel towards Putin to have a summit meeting sometimes in the near future, I think that also shows that the focus of attention is shifting. And I very much agree with what Alex said about Biden trying to get Russia off the agenda so it wouldn't pop up all the time when they try to build something. And that would be really useful because I think Russia here is only a distraction for the US when it comes to the real strategic challenges. Russia is not an existential challenge for the United States. Let's be very frank about it. China is one because it's an economic competitor. It is threatening vital US military and commercial interests in the Far East. Russia is not really doing that. Russia is picking the weakest links of NATO's eastern flank and trying to make some mess in the neighborhood of NATO, but basically that's it. So you do not really see that kind of systemic rivalry which you see between the US and China. And I think the Europeans were really frustrated for a long time that the US is not really recognizing this, because you see many major European countries, especially their big companies, who have tried to engage Russian business circles and were really upset with the sanctions and the Magnitsky interventions and so on and so forth. And they see this kind of thawing of the relationship as an opportunity. Maybe something we have seen in the case of JCPOA a couple of years ago, when there was this moment of goodwill between the US and Iran and all the others. And you know, all the European companies got crazy about selling something to Iran and buying Iranian oil. And I see a similar moment, if you wish, with Russia at the moment. Of course, I cannot predict it's going to be the same, but the feeling is that. And I think we have the understanding that the US might have a quid pro quo relationship with Russia. So for some favors vis-a-vis China, there might be some trade-offs for the other partners to make. And one of that might give a hard time to Ukraine, for example. Alex, you mentioned that the Exim Bank of the United States have paid back the debt of Ecuador to China, while the Chinese have brought a major Ukrainian company, Motor Sich, which is producing aircraft engines. And the US government forced the Ukrainians to quit that agreement, and now the Chinese are suing for damages, and Ukraine has to pay $3 billion to the Chinese because of the Americans asked them a favor. You know, how you convince your partners that you should heed to your advice when you end up in situations like these?
Yeah, I mean, it's another another one of those examples, are we really for sort of global market logic, right? Or sort of, strategic concerns? And I think, no, I mean, the Ukraine example is a very good one, that underscores all of those tensions involved.
Yes, and maybe I would take it even further. So, so one of my original questions would relate to how the United States could have Europe involved in spite of the structural differences that have emerged, because there are, I think, two, because the eastern flank of NATO they are always very preoccupied with Russia, and the rapprochement with Russia makes them nervous. And it's not only Ukraine, it's also Poland and the Baltic states and the like. And maybe even more importantly, you have Germany and France, the two major European players who are more into European strategic autonomy and pragmatic economic cooperation with Russia. They have extended economic relations and trade relations with China. And what we see unfolding is a great American-European transatlantic agreement on values and vague understanding about Chinese intentions, but the European support seems lukewarm. So I think this was the takeaway from the G7 meeting, that the Europeans were not that much enthusiastic. So there is this general agreement on the surface, but beneath them we see some sort of structural differences. So how do you see, would this narrative level, this superficial agreement on values between the Europeans and the Americans be enough to get them against China, or the structural differences would make the gap even wider in the future?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's one I think that really depends on nuanced interactions and an understanding of the incentives of different actors that we'll label European, right? Clearly, it's in the Commission's interest, right, to try and beat back and delegitimize these alternative Chinese European engagement structures, right? And why wouldn't it be? Like, why do you want to sanctify a 17+1 or a 16+1? Especially when it's a mix of countries that are in and out, and there is this sort of perception that they're undercutting both your authority and your regulatory power, right? Because that's EU power. It's this kind of harmonization, kind of regulatory, kind of passive, ability to sort of project, and that's not the same incentive as any particular European country. Right. So almost all European countries, with a few exceptions, we talked about Lithuania and the Balts. Romania has taken a much firmer anti-Beijing line lately, do have economic interests, and they want to hedge. Let's remember, in June 2017, it was Greece of all countries, that vetoed the EU's customary human rights critical statement against China, right? And the Greek foreign minister said that this wasn't a very constructive thing to engage in. So I think within these nuances, then you have, and I'm curious of Márton's sort of view on this, also intra-European games that are being played, and positions using the Chinese US competition as a divide to sort of reposition yourself in terms of sort of decision making and sort of relative sort of power shifts. So in this way, it's hard to separate out these issues from broader kind of struggles, I think, that have always gone on, both between the so-called new European members and the core of the EU, but also between the governing structures of the EU itself and the foreign policy apparatus of the most sort of powerful member states. Okay,
now we are short on time, so Marty, if you you could quickly answer to this question and the things that Alex said. And after that, I think we have to conclude this exciting meeting.
Well, first of all, I think that many EU member states are using EU foreign policy as a fig leaf to criticize partners that they otherwise wouldn't like to criticize. Because if you look at the statistics, you will see that China is Germany's biggest trading partner, surpassing the US in the last 2 years. So obviously, and the Merkel 5 minutes with President Xi about human rights is important, but even more important are those 90 minutes talking about business. So I got the feeling that some EU member states tend to outsource these kind of sensitive statements and communiques to the European Union, so they wouldn't have to take responsibility for that. Or they could say that, okay, all of the countries are agreeing on that, so I only have 1/27th of the responsibility at the end of the game. So please, Chinese companies, do not hate me. It was not me, it was the European Union. This is sustainable for some time, but as long as the big member states are interested in cooperating with China at the level that we see at the moment, as long as we see Airbus selling hundreds of jets, passenger jets to China, as we see Volkswagen earning a lot of money on the Chinese market, I think that, yeah, an EU communique on Xinjiang is great, but, it's basically nothing. It's just a bunch of words without any consequence. And of course, all the EU member states are trying to use these existing divisions on the US, on Russia, on China, on Africa, on the Middle East, and so on and so forth, to position themselves within the internal struggle between the member states and the struggle of the member states vis-a-vis the Commission and the Parliament, don't forget them as well. So this way, it's a highly complicated game. And in this case, I think that compartmentalizing tendency of US foreign policy, that how they're understanding and dealing with these countries is not really helpful here, because these are absolutely not black and white issues, as some people in the US foreign policy establishment imagine that.
Okay, thank you very much. If I want to be completely honest, then I would have yet another question. When do you come next for a conversation? But for this time, we are letting you go, but because you have to go. But thank you very much, and yes, we really hope that you will be able to join us again soon, because I think some of those issues, some of those topics were just becoming, more and more interesting during the conversation. So we all have further questions, but for now, we let you go. Thank you very much for coming. And
it was my pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation. Learned a lot from Márton's insights as well as the questions. So thank you for the opportunity. It's an exciting time to be looking at international affairs for sure.
Yes, please. Thank you indeed for coming, and thank you, Marty, as well. And thank you for all of you who followed us, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you.